I want you to imagine standing in a dusty, dimly lit laboratory, right? It's 1867. You're looking at the bones of this newly discovered sea monster that is like 40 feet long.
Like massive animal, yeah.
Huge. And you are one of the most brilliant scientific minds of your entire generation. You've got this fossilized skull in one hand, and you were staring at this absolutely baffling spine on the table, just trying to figure out how this animal was actually put together.
Which is not an easy puzzle.
Not at all. And after careful consideration, you confidently attach the head, wait for it, to the very tip of the tail.
Yeah, you literally build the animal backward.
Exactly. That is exactly what American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope did. He built an entire prehistoric apex predator completely backward. And he didn't just build it in private. He published detailed anatomical drawings of it. He was completely convinced that this animal propelled itself with this incredibly long snake-like tail and had this weirdly short, stumpy neck.
I mean, to be fair to Cope, it is completely understandable when you look at the sheer structural absurdity of what he was dealing with.
You think so? Because it sounds like a pretty massive blunder.
Oh, it was a huge blunder. But the actual anatomy of the plesiosaur was just so deeply counterintuitive. It was so radically detached from the rules of comparative anatomy that scientists had established at the time. Honestly, putting the head on the tail probably felt like the more logical solution to him.
That is just wild to me. So for everyone listening, I want you to completely forget the mental image of the slow, cold-blooded, sluggish swamp lizard. You know, the one that usually comes to mind when you hear the phrase ancient marine reptile?
Right, because that stereotype is entirely wrong.
Completely wrong. Today's deep dive is going to dismantle that stereotype bone by bone. Our mission today is to unpack a massive stack of research. We've got historical literature from the Natural History Museum and Fossil Era, alongside some absolutely brilliant biomechanical breakdowns from Fawad's Deep Blue, Mr. Science, and Dr. Polaris.
Those are some great sources.
They really are. And we're going to use them to figure out how an animal that looks like a literal mistake of nature, I mean, an absolute Frankenstein's monster, was actually an evolutionary masterpiece, one that dominated the oceans for over 140 million years.
Which is a staggering amount of time. We are looking at a creature that just shattered the boundaries of what a reptile could even be.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It forces us to reconsider thermoregulation, reproductive strategies, and even the fundamental physics of underwater locomotion.
Okay, I'm so ready for this.
But to really appreciate the biomechanical genius of the plesiosaur, we first have to appreciate just how badly it broke the minds of the people who found it in the ground.
Because Cope's backward skeleton wasn't the first time this animal made humanity look a bit ridiculous, was it?
Not even close.
The historical blunders go back centuries. I was looking through the Fossil Era archives. We can actually trace the bewilderment all the way back to 1605.
Oh, wow, early 17th century. Yeah. A guy named Richard Verstegen unearths these massive, bizarre vertebrae in Antwerp. And having literally zero framework for prehistoric marine reptiles, he just confidently declares that they belong to a giant fish.
Giant fish, right.
But it gets better. He actually uses this so-called giant fish as geological proof that Great Britain was once physically connected to the European continent, like a land bridge theory based on a misidentified sea monster.
I mean, that logical leap perfectly encapsulates the era, you know? You have to remember, the concept of extinction wouldn't even be formalized by Georges Cuvier until the late 18th century.
So the idea that an animal could just not exist anymore wasn't even on the table.
Exactly. In 1605, if you dug up a colossal bone, the scientific paradigm dictated that it must belong to a creature that currently exists. So, sure, a giant fish, or a mythical creature like a dragon, or perhaps even a giant human from biblical antiquity.
Speaking of biblical antiquity, that brings us to 1719, which might be the absolute peak of paleontological comedy for me.
The Nottinghamshire specimen.
Yes. So a partial skeleton is found in Nottinghamshire, England. And this fossil is literally just being used as a stone plate to reinforce the muddy slope of a local watering hole.
Just shoved in the mud to keep people from slipping.
Exactly. And William Stukeley, who's actually tipped off about this by Charles Darwin's great-grandfather, Robert Darwin, goes out to investigate it. And the locals had taken this majestic, ancient marine predator and put it on display in the vicarage, claiming it was the remains of a sinner drowned in the Great Flood.
Right. The diluvial theory. That was the dominant explanatory framework back then for basically any anomalous geological or paleontological finds.
Because if it's weird and it's in the dirt, the flood must have put it there.
Pretty much. Any marine fossil found inland was considered irrefutable evidence of Noah's flood. Now, Stukely, he applied a slightly more rigorous anatomical lens to it. He agreed with the flood context, but he recognized the morphology definitely wasn't human.
So he didn't buy the drowned center store.
Yeah. No, he suspected it was a marine animal, positing maybe a crocodile or a porpoise. But a true paradigm shift required a complete articulated skeleton, not just fragments.
Which didn't happen until the 1820s, thanks to the legendary Mary Anning.
She is an absolute icon of paleontology.
She really is. So from 1821 to 1823, William Conybeare finally gives these bones a formal name. He calls it Plesiosaurus, which means near lizard. But it's Anning, working those incredibly treacherous eroding cliffs of the Jurassic coast in Dorset, who finally pulls out the first virtually complete, perfectly articulated skeleton.
And Anning's specimen was a total watershed moment in vertebrate paleontology.
Because before that, they were just finding scattered pieces.
Right. Prior to her discovery, the isolated bones of plesiosaurs were routinely confused with those of ichthyosaurs, which had a much more conventional kind of dolphin-like morphology. Anning's skeleton, which was soon acquired by the Duke of Buckingham, presented a body plan that was so alien it basically defied belief.
Defied belief to the point that Georges Cuvier, who was like the undisputed heavyweight champion of anatomy at the time, he saw the drawings and immediately called it a hoax.
He did.
He actually accused Mary Anning of taking different animal fossils and physically cementing them together just to make a fake monster.
Well, Cuvier had pioneered this principle called the correlation of parts. He deeply believed that biological structures were so functionally integrated that if you had just one bone, you could predict the rest of the entire animal.
Like if you see a sharp tooth, you know it's a meat eater.
Exactly. A carnivore's tooth necessitated a jaw for tearing, which necessitated a certain type of neck muscle, and so on. The plesiosaur completely violated all of his rules.
How so?
Think about what it looks like. It possessed the broad, rigid torso of a turtle, the hyper-elongated neck of a snake, the paddle-like limbs of a sea turtle, or maybe a seal, and a skull that seemed disproportionately small and vaguely crocodilian.
So to Cuvier, it was literally an anatomical Frankenstein, just parts that shouldn't go together.
Exactly. It wasn't until Conybeare formally presented it at the Geological Society of London in 1824.
And wait, this is such a crazy historical coincidence. That was the exact same meeting where Megalosaurus, the very first dinosaur, was introduced, right?
Yes, the very same meeting. And that was the moment the scientific establishment finally had to accept that the plesiosaur was real.
But accepting it was real definitely didn't mean they understood how it worked. Which brings us right back to 1867. And the infamous bone wars between Edward Drinker Cope and Othniel Charles Marsh.
Ah, the Cope-Marsh rivalry. It is easily one of the most bitter, vitriolic chapters in the entire history of science.
Sounds exhausting, honestly.
It was characterized by bribery, theft, literally dynamiting fossil sites so the other guy couldn't get the bones, and relentless public humiliation. And the plesiosaur was actually the inciting incident for their deepest animosity.
Right. So a physician named Theophilus Turner finds this magnificent skeleton in Kansas and ships it to Cope. It's a newly discovered species that Cope names Elasmosaurus. And this is where he pulls the ultimate IKEA furniture assembly disaster.
Putting the skull on the tail?
Putting the table legs on the roof?
Yeah.
He attaches the head to the tail. But we have to give him a little bit of grace here, like you said earlier, because the anatomy is genuinely deceptive, isn't it?
It is. The deception lies in the zygapophyses.
The zygapophyses.
Okay, what are those? They are the articular processes that interlock adjacent vertebrae in the spine. In most tetrapods, you can orient a spine simply based on the direction these joints face. It tells you which way is front and which way is back.
Like puzzle pieces that only fit one way.
All right. But the vertebral column of Elasmosaurus was so highly derived that those standard morphological cues were basically obscured. Furthermore, Cope was looking at an animal with no hind limbs preserved in that specific rock matrix.
Oh, so he didn't have the back flippers to help him figure out where the hips were.
Exactly. And on top of that, he was dealing with a vertebral count that was, frankly, absurd.
So Cope builds this backwards monster, and he's so proud of it that he invites Marsh and another prominent anatomist, Joseph Leidy, to inspect his reconstructed masterpiece.
A terrible mistake on his part.
Truly. And the way Leidy dismantles him is almost cinematic. Like, I can just picture it. He doesn't yell. He doesn't argue with Cope. Leidy just quietly picks up the skull from the quote-unquote tail, walks all the way down to the other end of this massive skeleton, and perfectly articulates the skull with what Cope thought was the last tail vertebra.
It's brutal.
He proves instantly and completely silently that Cope built the thing backward.
And the psychological blow to Cope was devastating. He actually frantically attempted to purchase and destroy every single printed copy of the scientific journal that contained his erroneous reconstruction.
Just trying to scrub it from the historical record.
Yeah, but Marsh had already secured a copy, and he made sure the entire academic world knew exactly about the blunder.
Classic Marsh.
But, beyond the interpersonal drama of the Bone Wars, this incident exposes a really fundamental question regarding biomechanics. Why was a neck so exceptionally long that a brilliant scientist could literally mistake it for a propulsion tail?
I was looking at the schematics for Albertan necks, which is a later species from the Cretaceous period, and its neck is composed of 76 cervical vertebrae. 76.
It's an astronomical number.
We have 7. Giraffes have 7. To have 76 vertebrae stretching out longer than the entire rest of the animal's body, it just looks physically impossible. How do you even support that much weight? How do you pump blood up that distance?
That is exactly the crux of why early paleobiology struggled so much. They lacked the biomechanical models to understand it. In a terrestrial environment, like on land, a neck of that length and mass would require a skeletal and muscular infrastructure so robust that it would essentially immobilize the animal.
It would just be too heavy to lift.
Exactly. Not to mention the systolic blood pressure required to pump blood against gravity all the way up to the brain. But the marine environment fundamentally alters those physics.
Because of the water.
Right. Buoyancy mitigates that gravitational constraint.
But even in the water, a neck that long seems like it would just snap, or at least be incredibly unwieldy. If you look at vintage textbook illustrations, they always show these animals floating on the surface of the water with their necks looping around like swans, or striking like a coiled snake underwater.
And those illustrations are a primary example of imposing terrestrial logic onto marine anatomy.
So they were wrong.
Completely wrong. When paleontologists perform detailed osteological analysis, specifically looking at the neural spines and those interlocking zygapophyses of those 76 vertebrae, they find extreme limitations on vertical flexion.
Meaning they couldn't bend them up and down very much.
Correct. The neck absolutely could not bend into a swan-like S-curve above the water. It was functionally quite stiff.
Wait, I'm trying to picture this. If a long, flexible neck is the perfect weapon for a snake to strike quickly, why would an apex predator in the ocean evolve a neck that is rigid and stiff? Wouldn't a fast whipping motion be the most efficient way to catch a darting fish?
It seems like it, until you factor in fluid dynamics. Specifically, you have to look at the concept of drag.
Drag in the water.
Yes. Water is approximately 800 times denser than air. If you attempt a rapid lateral whipping motion with a massive elongated cylinder, which is essentially what a plesiosaur neck is, the hydrodynamic resistance is astronomical.
Right. I'm imagining trying to stand in a swimming pool and swing a long, heavy PVC pipe horizontally through the water as fast as I can.
It's incredibly difficult.
The water just fights you the whole way, the energy expenditure is massive, and the movement ends up being painfully slow no matter how hard you push.
That is exactly the right analogy. A lateral strike in the water would generate a massive pressure wave, which would alert any prey long before the jaws ever got close. And the energetic cost to the predator would be completely unsustainable.
So a flexible whipping neck is out.
Right. Instead, the biomechanical modeling from researchers like the work done by Fawad's Deep Blue suggests the neck functioned a lot more like a biological crane or stealth pole. The robust, muscular rigidity was actually the entire point.
Okay, so the massive bulk of the body is churning the water, displacing a ton of fluid, but the head is isolated from all of that turbulence because it's so far out in front.
Precisely. The enormous body remains suspended in the murky depths, sometimes several meters away from the target. The stiff neck allows the relatively tiny skull to glide forward with surgical precision and minimal hydrodynamic disturbance.
Oh, that is so creepy, but so smart.
The prey never registers the pressure wave of the massive body until the jaws just snap shut around them. It's an ambush predator, but it uses reach instead of speed.
That stealth is incredible. But once they catch the prey, they still have to navigate these vast oceans. And their method of locomotion is just as bizarre as the neck, if not more so.
Oh, absolutely.
Because you look at an ichthyosaur or a mosasaur, a shark, or a whale, and the engine of the animal is always the tail. The tail sweeps side to side or up and down to create thrust, and the flippers just kind of steer. But the plesiosaur barely has a tail at all. It's just a little rudder. The entire propulsion system is built into 4 massive flippers.
Which represents a completely unique solution in vertebrate evolution. They evolved a 4-flipper propulsion system, which required fundamentally redesigning the limb architecture. They did this through a process called hyperphalangy.
Right. I was reading the Natural History Museum breakdown on this. Hyperphalangy means an extreme proliferation of the finger and toe bones, right?
Yes, exactly.
So instead of 3 or 4 bones in a finger like we have, a single digit in a plesiosaur flipper could contain up to 18 distinct phalanges.
18 bones in one finger. And by multiplying the phalanges like that, the animal creates an elongated, densely packed internal scaffolding. Those bones are tightly bound by ligaments, basically eliminating flexibility at what we would consider the wrist, the elbow, or the knee.
So they can't bend their arms.
Right. The limb ceases to be an articulated appendage and becomes a single, rigid, highly streamlined hydrofoil.
They aren't dog paddling out there. They aren't rowing like oars on a rowboat.
Not at all. They are essentially flying underwater. The kinematics involve a highly complex up and down stroke pattern.
Like a bird.
Or like a penguin, or a sea turtle. They generate lift and thrust on both the downstroke and the upstroke. But the incredible thing is, the plesiosaur had 4 of these hydrofoils acting simultaneously.
And this is where the physics get truly mind-blowing to me. Because when fluid dynamicists actually built robotic plesiosaur flippers and ran flow models in water tanks, they discovered that the 4 flippers weren't just flapping randomly or alternately, they were synchronized to exploit the fluid turbulence.
Yes, the wake capture effect.
The back flippers actually rode the wake generated by the front flippers.
It's a brilliant application of unsteady aerodynamics. When the front flipper sweeps through the water, it sheds a vortex.
Like a little underwater tornado, basically.
Yeah.
It's a swirling mass of fluid carrying kinetic energy. And the rear flipper is perfectly timed to pass right through that vortex. It extracts that residual energy to increase its own thrust while simultaneously drastically reducing the drag it experiences.
It is the biological equivalent of bicyclists drafting in the Tour de France, where the lead rider breaks the air resistance and the rider behind them coasts in the slipstream.
Exactly.
Or like a tandem rotor helicopter, like a Chinook, where the rotors are synced up so perfectly they don't fight each other's turbulence. The plesiosaur was essentially drafting off its own front limbs. That is just an unbelievable level of evolutionary engineering.
And the efficiency metrics from those tank tests are just staggering. This 4-flipper wake capture system provided a perfect balance. It gave them the endurance for long ocean crossings, but also the agility for pivoting instantly to strike prey.
It's the perfect underwater engine.
But and there's always in biology, all of this lift and thrust creates a secondary problem.
If you are a marine reptile with highly efficient hydrofoils and you have massive lungs because you have to breathe air, you have a severe buoyancy issue.
Oh, because lungs are just big balloons of air inside your chest.
Exactly. You are effectively a biological cork.
So if they stopped swimming and flapping those hydrofoils, they would just pop right up to the surface.
Precisely.
So how do you remain suspended in the water column? Like, you have this amazing stealth pole neck, but it's useless if you can't hover in the murky depths to use it.
You engineer an internal weight belt.
A weight belt.
Yes. Plesiosaurs exhibit an extreme degree of pachyostosis.
Pachyostosis.
Right. This is a condition where the bones become extraordinarily dense and massive. In most terrestrial animals, and even in many marine mammals, the internal structure of the bone is spongy. It's filled with a web of trabeculae to keep the skeleton relatively lightweight but strong.
Right, our bones have lots of little air pockets in them.
But plesiosaur bones are nearly solid, compact tissue.
They intentionally evolved incredibly heavy bones to act as ballast. It's exactly like a scuba diver putting lead weights on a belt so they can achieve neutral buoyancy. That way they can hover effortlessly without constantly kicking to stay down.
It's the exact same principle. And this perfect balance of heavy bones, weight-capturing flippers, and a stealthy neck served them beautifully during the early Mesozoic.
The ultimate marine predators.
But evolutionary pressures are never static. As we move into the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, the oceans underwent a really dramatic shift, which we now call the Mesozoic Marine Revolution.
Right, the Marine Revolution. This is essentially an underwater arms race that took place over millions of years, right?
That's a great way to describe it.
You have this massive diversification of marine life.
Mm-hmm.
Prey species start evolving thicker armor, heavier shells, defensive spikes. And at the same time, the open water becomes a battleground for larger, faster, and just much more aggressive predators.
The selective pressures of that revolution basically forced the plesiosaur lineage into a morphological bifurcation.
A split in the family tree.
Exactly. The foundational body plan was so versatile, so fundamentally solid, that it split into two highly specialized, radically divergent ecological niches.
It's like a navy realizing that a single type of ship can't win a global war, so they split their manufacturing into two distinct fleets.
I like that analogy.
On one side, you have the stealth submarines, right? The long necks or the plesiosauromorphs. And on the other side, you have the heavily armored, high-speed battleships, the plesiosauromorphs.
Right. Let's look at the plesiosauromorphs' first genera, like Elasmosaurus and Cryptocleidos. They doubled down on the ancestral strategy. They elongated the neck even further, if you can believe it, and specialized in harvesting smaller, very agile prey. Things like schools of fish and soft-bodied cephalopods like squid and belemnites.
I was absolutely fascinated by the sensory upgrades they evolved to maintain this stealth submarine strategy, because they didn't just rely on vision, did they?
No, they had to be much more versatile than that.
I read that some long-necked species had these intricate grooves deeply etched into the roofs of their mouths. And biomechanists believe these grooves literally channeled water directly over specialized olfactory sensors.
Yes. They functioned very much like the Jacobson's organ in modern snakes.
So they were smelling the water.
Exactly. It allowed the animal to detect minute chemical gradients in the ocean. They were effectively directional tracking systems, letting them, quote-unquote, sniff the water to locate schools of squid or track injured prey, even in really low visibility conditions.
Like underwater bloodhounds.
And when you combine that chemical tracking with eyes that were situated relatively high on the skull, they could stalk prey from below, silhouetting them against the photic zone, the light near the surface.
A completely silent, chemically guided stealth hunter.
Very effective.
But then you look at the other branch of the family tree, the pliosaurs, and they threw stealth completely out the window in favor of absolute brute force. Like I said, if the long necks are submarines, the pliosaurs are dreadnoughts.
They really are. The pliosaurs completely inverted the anatomical ratios. They evolved these short, massively muscled necks just to support skulls of incomprehensible size.
How big are we talking?
Well, genera like Liopleurodon, Plesiosaurus, and Kronosaurus possessed skulls that could reach nearly 10 feet in length.
10 feet. I want everyone listening to visualize a skull the size of a modern compact car, packed with conical teeth the size of bananas, and attached to a 35-foot body that's being propelled by those 4 hyper-efficient hydrofoils we talked about.
They were terrifying. They occupied the absolute apex predatory niche, highly analogous to modern orcas or great white sharks.
They weren't eating little squids.
No, they completely abandoned the delicate, needle-like teeth of the long necks, which were designed to cage and snare slippery fish, and they evolved heavily rooted, incredibly robust teeth capable of shattering thick bone and crushing turtle shells.
We have to talk about the absolute terror of Plesiosaurus fungi.
Predator X.
Yes, the species that was dubbed Predator X when it was unearthed in the permafrost of Svalbard. When biomechanists run finite element analysis on the skull architecture of this specific animal, they estimate a bite force of around 33,000 pounds per square inch.
Which is an almost unimaginable number.
To contextualize that metric, a modern saltwater crocodile, which currently possesses the strongest measured bite force of any living animal on Earth, tops out around 3,700 psi.
Right.
And a Tyrannosaurus rex is estimated at around 8,000 psi. The pliosaur is exerting 4 times the crushing power of a T-Rex.
And we know exactly how they generated that force. The sagittal crests on the top of the skull indicate temporalis muscles of just staggering volume and leverage.
And the scary part is, we don't just have to rely on computer models to know how violent they were. We have the fossilized victims to prove it. Paleontologists have found the remains of ichthyosaurs and even other long-necked plesiosaurs with massive catastrophic gouges carved into their bones that perfectly match pliosaur dentition.
Yes, the taphonomic evidence is brutal. The trauma on those fossils indicates hunting behaviors very similar to modern crocodiles.
The death roll.
Exactly. When a pliosaur intercepted a prey item that was simply too massive to swallow whole, it would clamp down with that 33,000 psi grip and execute a death roll. It would use its 4 massive flippers to violently torque its entire body, shearing off massive chunks of flesh and bone.
Wow. Which actually highlights a fascinating dietary quirk that spans across both branches of this family, but is incredibly prominent in the long necks. And that is the swallowing of scones, or gastroliths.
Gastroliths are one of the most hotly debated features in plesiosaur biology,
Why is that?
because it is exceedingly common to excavate a pristine, articulated plesiosaur skeleton and find a localized accumulation of smooth, highly polished rocks situated right where the stomach would have been.
And we aren't talking about accidentally swallowing a little pebble while diving for a fish. A specimen of Styxosaurus was recovered with over 250 distinct stones in its abdominal cavity, and they weighed nearly 30 pounds combined.
A massive payload of rock.
Yeah. And geological analysis of the rocks shows they don't even match the sedimentary bedrock where the animal died. This animal was actively seeking out specific types of hard stones and traveling immense distances just to ingest them. Why on earth would you carry 30 pounds of rocks in your stomach?
Well, the scientific consensus generally oscillates between 2 primary hypotheses. The first is mechanical digestion.
Like a bird.
Exactly. Because the long-necked plesiosaurs lacked the robust skulls and the complex dentition required to chew or process food, they swallowed their fish and tough cephalopods completely whole. A muscular gizzard filled with 250 grinding stones would act as a gastric mill. It would physically pulverize the shells and bones inside the stomach to maximize nutrient extraction.
I mean, that makes perfect sense given the anatomy. You see far more gastroliths in the longnecks than you do in the pliosaurs, who were already mechanically breaking down their food by tearing it into chunks with the death roll.
Right. But the second hypothesis loops back to our earlier discussion on buoyancy.
Oh, the weight belt idea.
Exactly. While pachystotic bone provides static, unchangeable ballast, gastroliths could serve as adjustable dynamic ballast. If an animal needed to fine-tune its center of mass for stability in turbulent ocean currents, ingesting or regurgitating stones offers an immediate physiological solution.
The idea of a 40-foot marine reptile swallowing 30 pounds of rocks to trim its buoyancy like a high-tech deep-sea submersible is just brilliant.
It's an elegant solution to a complex physical problem.
But, as much as their hunting and their biomechanics completely shatter our expectations, the way they lived and reproduced completely rewrites the biological rulebook.
Without a doubt.
Because up until very recently, we just assumed they were bound by the fundamental limitations of being a reptile.
Right. When we observe extant marine reptiles, animals alive today, like sea turtles, marine iguanas, or sea snakes, the vast majority remain tethered to the terrestrial environment for reproduction.
They always have to go back to land.
They do. A leatherback sea turtle can migrate across entire ocean basins. It can dive to incredible depths, but it must eventually drag its massive bulk onto a sandy beach to excavate a nest and lay eggs.
And I want listeners to picture the sheer physical impossibility of a plesiosaur trying to do that. You have an animal that weighs multiple tons. It has a completely rigid, turtle-like torso. Its limbs are stiff hydrofoils with literally no elbows or knees to push against the ground.
They couldn't crawl if they tried.
And it has a 20-foot neck acting as a massive lever arm. If a plesiosaur washed up on a beach, it would crush its own internal organs under its own weight. It would be an absolute death sentence.
And paleontologists recognized this morphological paradox for decades. The anatomical design explicitly prohibited terrestrial locomotion. Yet, because they were phylogenetically classified as reptiles, the assumption of oviparity egg-laying just stubbornly persisted.
Because reptiles lay eggs, that was the rule.
Exactly. It wasn't until a landmark discovery in 2011 that the paradigm was forcibly shifted.
The polycotyledonous fossil. This is one of those scientific discoveries that makes you want to jump out of your chair.
It's an incredible specimen.
Paleontologists in Kansas excavate an adult plesiosaur, but situated perfectly within its abdominal cavity is the articulated skeleton of a single, highly developed fetus.
And the taphonomy of the site, the way the fossil was preserved, definitively ruled out the possibility that the adult had simply consumed a smaller plesiosaur for a meal.
It wasn't just digestion.
No. The positioning within the body cavity, the absolute lack of any digestive acid etching on the fetal bones, and the specific developmental stage of the skeleton confirmed it. Plesiosaurs were viviparous.
They gave birth to live young.
They gave birth to live young in the open pelagic zone.
By evolving live birth, they completely sever their evolutionary anchor to the shoreline. They were truly, fully aquatic creatures. But the most shocking part of that fossil wasn't just that it was a baby, it was the size of the baby.
Whoa, it's enormous.
Most marine reptiles, like sea turtles, lay hundreds of small eggs at once. They play the numbers game, hoping just a tiny fraction of them survive the mad dash to the sea.
That is referred to in ecology as an rye-selected reproductive strategy. You are maximizing the quantity of offspring while minimizing the biological investment in any single individual. The polycautelus fossil demonstrated the exact opposite strategy.
Right, it contained just one massive fetus.
One fetus, estimated to be roughly a third the size of the mother.
A third of her size.
Which is a classic case-selected reproductive strategy.
Meaning the mother is pouring an astronomical amount of biological energy, nutrients, and time into developing one highly advanced offspring. Which brings us to the most poignant research I've seen on this entire topic. The Natural History Museum in Los Angeles performed an incredible study on another pregnant plesiosaur fossil. And to get their answers, they actually had to use destructive sampling.
Destructive sampling is a highly controversial and very rare procedure in paleontology.
Because you're destroying the fossil, right?
Partially, yes. Curators are understandably very reluctant to physically drill into priceless, one-of-a-kind specimens. But the potential data locked within the bone histology of the specimen was just too significant to ignore. So they extracted microcores from both the maternal skeleton and the fetal skeleton.
They slide these tiny cross-sections under a microscope to look at the cellular structure, the Haversian canals, the actual architecture of how the bone was deposited. And what they find is that the fetal bones were growing at an explosive rate.
Very fast growth.
But there's a biological trade-off for that speed. To grow that fast, the baby's bones had to be incredibly spongy and porous.
And the implications of that porosity are profound when we recall our earlier discussion on buoyancy.
The weight belt.
Right. The mother relied on highly dense pachystotic bone to counteract the extreme buoyancy of her lungs. The fetus, however, possessed spongy lightweight bone.
Let me push back on this for a second, because this sounds like a massive evolutionary flaw. If a baby plesiosaur is born into the open ocean with spongy bones and huge lungs, it's going to be a biological cork.
It is.
It won't be able to dive efficiently to escape predators, and it won't have the internal mass to generate the momentum needed for that weight-capturing flight we talked about. How does it not just instantly become a snack for a passing pliosaur?
It survives through the behavioral mechanism that is inextricably linked to case-selected reproduction. Intensive maternal care.
Mother stays with it.
The histological evidence strongly infers that the mother did not simply give birth and abandon the calf to its fate. The sheer biological cost of gestating a single massive infant demands that the mother protect her investment.
So we are looking at an animal that nurses, or at least actively provisions, its young. The mother stays with the calf, physically shielding it, potentially teaching it to hunt, keeping it safe until its skeletal density slowly reaches the threshold required for independent survival.
That is the most logical conclusion.
But this is mammalian behavior. It's exactly what modern whales and dolphins do. If they give live birth in the open ocean, invest heavily in maternal care, and have hydrofoil flippers, calling them reptiles feels entirely inadequate.
The taxonomic label reptile carries a lot of historical baggage that plesiosaurs simply discard. And honestly, nowhere is that more evident than in their metabolic physiology.
Their metabolism.
Right. The traditional assumption is that all reptiles are ectothermic cold-blooded. Their internal temperature fluctuates constantly with the ambient environment. They rely entirely on behavioral thermoregulation, like basking on a hot rock, to catalyze their metabolism and give them energy.
Which, again, presents a massive logistical problem for a plesiosaur.
Yeah.
You can't bask on a sun-drenched rock if you are a multi-ton animal stranded in the middle of a freezing, turbulent ocean.
And geochemical analysis proves they didn't need to. Paleoclimatologists use a fascinating technique called isotopic thermometry.
How does that work?
They analyze the specific ratio of oxygen-18 to oxygen-16 isotopes that are preserved within the bioappetite of fossilized plesiosaur tooth enamel. Because oxygen isotopes fractionate or separate at different rates depending on the ambient temperature when the tooth was formed, this ratio serves as a permanent chemical thermometer recording the animal's internal body heat.
And when they run those numbers on plesiosaur teeth, the isotope ratios show that plesiosaurs maintained high, stable internal body temperatures, completely independent of the water temperature around them. They were endothermic. They were warm-blooded.
Yes. And the isotopic data is perfectly corroborated by the histological data we just discussed. The rapid bone deposition rates observed in the fossils are only metabolically possible in an endothermic organism. A cold-blooded animal simply cannot grow bone that quickly. Furthermore, we have paleobiogeographic evidence that decisively shuts down the cold-blooded hypothesis forever.
You were talking about the polar specialists.
I
We literally find plesiosaur fossils in regions that were brutally cold. In the early Cretaceous, parts of modern-day Australia and Antarctica were situated well within the polar circles. Now, while the global Mesozoic climate was generally warmer than it is today, these specific marine environments still endured near-freezing water temperatures and months of absolute, sunless winter darkness.
And if a large ectothermic reptile attempted to navigate those waters, its metabolic rate would just plummet. It would become completely lethargic, unable to hunt, and eventually succumb to the cold.
It would freeze to death.
Yet the fossil record shows plesiosaurs not merely surviving, but thriving as active apex predators in these frigid, high-latitude seas.
So we have to completely reframe our vision of the Mesozoic era. It wasn't just a humid, stagnant greenhouse swamp everywhere. There were dynamic, freezing, churning oceans. And navigating through the ice floes with these warm-blooded, highly active mothers fiercely protecting their calves. They're so much closer biologically to a pod of killer whales than they are to an iguana.
Absolutely. And their unique physiological mosaic provided one final, monumental advantage that allowed them to survive the brutal environmental fluctuations of the Mesozoic.
What were they?
Throughout the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods, the planet experienced intense spikes in volcanic activity, leading to severe oceanic anoxic events, or OAEs.
Right, OAEs. These are periods where massive algal blooms die off, they sink to the bottom, and as they decompose, they suck almost all the dissolved oxygen out of vast stretches of the ocean.
It creates enormous dead zones. For organisms dependent on gills like fish, sharks, and the ammonites, an anoxic event is an inescapable death sentence. They literally suffocate in the water.
But the plesiosaurs didn't have gills.
Exactly. They retain the lungs inherited from their distant terrestrial ancestors. What was once a requirement for living on land became an ultimate marine superpower. When the water turned toxic and suffocating, plesiosaurs simply bypassed the crisis entirely.
They just swam to the surface.
They swam to the surface, took a deep breath of atmospheric oxygen, and dove back down to feast on the suffocating ecosystem.
Wow. Lungs, warm blood, live birth, hydrofoil flight, and 33,000 psi bite forces. It is the ultimate survival toolkit.
It really is.
And it worked for 140 million years. That immense span of time is almost impossible to conceptualize. But let's try to map out how they conquered the globe.
Well, the timeline originates in the aftermath of the Permian-Triassic extinction event, which is often called the Great Dying. Nearly 90% of all life on Earth was eradicated.
A clean slate for evolution.
Basically. In the ecological vacuum of the early Triassic, a group of terrestrial reptiles, the basal sauropterygians, including early forms like pachyplesiosaurs and nothosaurs, began experimenting with aquatic environments.
These were the early transitional models, right? They still retained functional joints in their limbs.
Huh.
They're amphibious, hunting in the coastal shallows, and probably hauling themselves onto the mudflats like seals.
Yes. But by the late Triassic, roughly 203 million years ago, the true plesiosaurs finally emerged. The hyperphalange locked their limbs into rigid hydrofoils, viviparity severed their need to return to land, and they radiated into every conceivable marine environment on the entire planet.
They were spectacularly adaptable. We always think of them strictly as open ocean dwellers, but the fossil record proves they invaded freshwater systems as well.
They certainly did.
We have unearthed distinct freshwater plesiosaur species from ancient river deltas and shallow lake beds in modern-day China, Canada, and Morocco.
The morphological plasticity of the group allowed them to exploit highly specific niche ecological zones. Consider ophthalmothule, for instance. It's a genus discovered in the high-latitude, frigid waters of the Arctic.
The eye sockets on ophthalmothule are gigantic. They take up a huge portion of the skull.
The enlarged orbits, supported by these robust sclerotic rings of bone, allowed for maximum light gathering. This adaptation specifically facilitated hunting in the aphotic deep water zones or during the prolonged pitch-black darkness of the polar winter.
Evolving night vision for the long winter.
Precisely. But perhaps the most radical deviation in their entire evolutionary history occurred down in Antarctica with a bizarre genus called Morturnaria.
Morturnaria is the animal that truly solidified for me how brilliant evolution is.
It's a strange one.
Very strange. When paleontologists found its skull, it didn't have the bone-crushing teeth of a plesiosaur. And it didn't have the interlocking, cage-like needle teeth of a typical long neck. It had hundreds of incredibly fine, delicate teeth projecting outward.
Which is very peculiar because that dental morphology was completely unsuited for capturing individual prey items like a fish or a squid. Instead, biomechanical modeling indicates that Mortoneria utilized those teeth as a sieve.
A sieve.
It would engulf an enormous volume of water teeming with microscopic crustaceans and plankton, and then it would force the water out through those tightly interlocking teeth, trapping the biomass inside its mouth.
It was filter feeding. It was executing the exact same ecological role using the exact same mechanical process as modern baleen whales like the blue whale or the humpback, millions of years before the first whale ever existed.
This is one of the most elegant examples of convergent evolution in the entire fossil record.
Convergent evolution.
Yes, convergent evolution occurs when disparate, unrelated lineages face identical environmental pressures and arrive at the exact same biomechanical solution. Mortoneria converged perfectly on the Mysticete filter-feeding niche. Meanwhile, the massive pliosaurs converged perfectly on the odontocete or toothed whale pursuit predator niche.
The way some of these fossils are preserved is just as magical as the biology itself. Have you seen the taphonomy of the fossils found in Lightning Ridge, Australia?
The opalized bones.
Yes, it's an opal mining town.
Yeah.
And they have excavated plesiosaur bones where the specific geochemical conditions of the groundwater perfectly replace the biological bone matrix with hydrated silica over millions of years. They literally dig up plesiosaur skeletons made entirely of iridescent, glowing, precious opal.
The taphonomic process of opalization requires highly specific acidic groundwater conditions acting upon the buried organic material. To have such biomechanically advanced creatures preserved as literal gemstones is scientifically invaluable, but also just aesthetically profound.
But I want to put this 140 million year dynasty into perspective for people. We always look at the Tyrannosaurus rex as the ultimate symbol of the prehistoric past.
The king of the dinosaurs.
Right. But the T-Rex evolved at the very end of the Cretaceous period, around 68 million years ago. The earliest plesiosaurs evolved over 200 million years ago.
A massive time gap.
That means a T-Rex lived closer in time to us sitting here right now talking into our microphones than it did to the dawn of the plesiosaurs.
The magnitude of their evolutionary success really cannot be overstated. And because of that, it is crucial to reevaluate how their narrative concludes.
Their extinction.
Right. The popular misconception is that bizarre prehistoric animals died out because their anatomy was somehow flawed or obsolete or an evolutionary dead end.
But the plesiosaurs didn't slowly fade away because they were a mistake. They were thriving, highly diversified apex predators right up until the literal end of the world.
Exactly. 66 million years ago, the Chicxulub impact event injected billions of tons of vaporized rock and sulfur into the stratosphere.
The asteroid.
The asteroid. The resulting nuclear winter completely blocked solar radiation for years. And in the oceans, the phytoplankton, which is the foundational photosynthetic layer of the entire marine food web, experienced catastrophic mass mortality.
Because they need the sun to survive.
Right. And when the phytoplankton dies, the zooplankton dies, then the small fish die, the squid die, the entire trophic pyramid collapses completely from the bottom up.
Precisely. The extinction of the plesiosaurs was not a failure of their biomechanical design. They were simply victims of a thermodynamic collapse. The marine ecosystem could no longer generate the sheer caloric energy required to sustain multi-ton endothermic apex predators. Nature didn't scrap the blueprint. The factory just burned down.
That's a good way to put it.
But because they vanished so absolutely, leaving absolutely no direct descendants, unlike the theropod dinosaurs that live on today as birds, we have always struggled with their absence. And I think that psychological struggle is directly responsible for modern mythology.
You are referring to the enduring cryptozoological phenomenon of the Loch Ness Monster.
Think about the iconic silhouette of Nessie.
Mm.
The massive humped body, the 4 diamond-shaped flippers, the incredibly long swan-like neck rising out of the mist.
Yeah.
We literally just took a 19th century scientifically inaccurate textbook illustration of a plesiosaur and dropped it into a Scottish lake.
The morphological template for the monster was undeniably provided by those early paleontological reconstructions.
You just projected it onto the lake.
And that specific iconography was permanently seared into the global consciousness by the 1934 surgeon's photograph.
The famous black and white picture.
Right, which, despite being definitively debunked as a toy submarine fitted with a sculpted plastic wood head, completely established the visual canon for the monster.
We wanted the plesiosaur to survive so badly that we literally faked it. But modern science has brought a new tool to Loch Ness, right? Environmental DNA testing.
eDNA, yes.
Researchers recently swept the law, filtering the water to sequence every scrap of cellular material shed by the organisms living there. And they found zero reptilian DNA. What they did find was a massive abundance of eel DNA. So if there's a monster in there, it's just a giant eel, not a surviving Mesozoic reptile.
The eDNA results reinforce a sobering reality about paleontology. We are fundamentally limited by the nature of the fossil record.
What do you mean?
Through biomechanics, isotopic analysis, and histology, we have successfully deduced their locomotion, their thermoregulation, and their reproductive strategies. But there is an entire dimension of their existence that is irrevocably lost to deep time.
Because the stone preserves the mechanics, but it deletes the behavior.
Exactly.
We will never know what color their skin was. We will never know if the long necks had bright iridescent patterns for mating displays. We don't know how they played or how they courted or what their social structures were.
Behavior simply does not fossilize. However, applying the principle of convergent evolution we discussed earlier opens up a deeply provocative avenue for scientific speculation.
Let's pull on that thread then. We established that plesiosaurs converge perfectly on the physical and ecological traits of modern cetaceans, whales and dolphins.
They did.
They evolved the filter-feeding mechanics of baleen whales with Mortonaria. They evolved the apex pursuit predator mechanics of killer whales with the plesiosaurs. They utilized the exact same case-selected reproductive strategy, investing immense energy into single, live-born calves and providing intense maternal care.
So the question becomes, if the environmental pressures of the marine ecosystem force them to converge so heavily on the physiological and ecological adaptations of modern cetaceans, is it not scientifically plausible that they also converged on their behavioral adaptations?
I mean, cetaceans are defined by their complex, highly social intelligence. Dolphins hunt cooperatively using synchronized tactics. Orcas have distinct cultural dialects passed down through generations. Humpback whales communicate across entire ocean basins using intricate, constantly shifting songs.
And the neurological hardware required for such behaviors rarely leaves a definitive trace in endocasts of the skull. But given the immense evolutionary parallels we've seen, it is highly probable that plesiosaurs possessed a social complexity far, far exceeding our traditional assumptions of reptilian behavior.
What if the Mesozoic oceans weren't just a silent feeding ground? What if they were filled with the whale songs of plesiosaurs? What if they were vast underwater symphonies, mothers calling to their calves, pliosaurs coordinating ambushes, long necks singing across the dark, freezing polar waters?
That's a beautiful thought.
An entire rich culture of sound, socialization, and intelligence operating for 140 million years, completely deleted from history just because sound waves don't turn to stone.
It is a profoundly humbling concept. It reminds us that our reconstruction of the past, no matter how rigorous our science is ultimately only a skeletal framework. The living, breathing reality of the Mesozoic was infinitely more vibrant, chaotic, and complex than the fossils alone can ever convey.
So the next time you see a skeleton in a museum that looks confusing or clunky or just impossible to understand, I want you to remember the watering hole in Nottinghamshire. Remember Edward Drinker Cope confidently putting the head on the tail. Don't assume nature made a mistake. Assume instead that nature built a masterpiece and we just haven't figured out how to read the blueprint yet.
A vital lesson in intellectual humility.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the extraordinary world of the plesiosaurs. Keep asking questions, keep wondering about the mysteries beneath the waves, and we will see you next time.